Elizabeth here at ARC, and I'm with Matt Glamore, the organiser for the ARC After Party. Can you tell the audience about the After Party?
So I was approached by Jordan Peterson's assistant, and Sovereign House, who are a club in New York, to organise something for the younger people of ARC. Last year they said that it was a bit boomer-con, even though I'm a boomer myself. No, I'm not actually, I'm Gen X, but anywho. Yeah, so they said that they just wanted to do something a bit more fun at the end of the conference. So we all got together in New York last summer and hatched an evil plan to get all the kids together down the disco at the end of ARC. So it's a club event. It's a kind of traditional nightclub event with DJs and drinking and general carrying on. But I do believe one can have a good fun night out and it not be too debauched.
And who's going to be there? Who's playing?
Well, so we have Danny Rampling is DJing, who's an old friend of mine. He's a big part of the freedom movement, the UK freedom movement now, that really grew up out of the lockdowns. Danny and I first knew each other we first met in 1988.
Oh, wow, that's a long time
He
ago.
had a club in South London called Shoom, and Shoom was one of the very first acid house nightclubs. And it was very revolutionary at the time. It was a new sound, a whole kind of new style. And I had been very involved in the nightclub scene throughout the mid-80s. And it was a very hierarchical, fashion, art, kind of music-based, very arch. There was a lot of money involved in the music industry of the 80s. So it was an establishment. It was a very strict establishment. And then when Acid House hit in 87, 88, I was hosting a club called Heverin, which was a big club in Charing Cross. And we were the first clubs to start playing the kind of new sound of acid house music at my club, Pyramid. Mark Moore was the DJ. Anyway, Danny had another club called Shoom, and we were all just starting out. And Shoom became really one of the seminal nightclubs of that period. And it was just so different to everything that had gone before, where everything had been quite rigid and posy and fashion-based. Shoom was just kind of kids with their tops off in tracky bottoms, dancing around to a smoke machine in a strobe light. And it really overturned the social hierarchy of the 80s. It was a very exciting time. And so Danny was the DJ there.
That's great. And you were a musician yourself?
I was always a musician and producer, record producer. But very underground, kind of underground avant-garde art, rock, performance art. So a lot of my work was back in those days associated with various forms of performance art and video. I always wanted to be more of a music producer, but I ended up becoming a pop video director for money back in those days.
Oh wow, so you directed pop music?
I made a lot of pop videos,
What, any famous ones?
I worked with a lot of the bands, a lot of the acid house people, because they were the people that I knew, but I did all the Shaman videos. There was a band called the Shaman who were very much a part of the kind of rising New Age philosophy at the time, and I was also always involved with the kind of pagan and New Age belief systems, and so the Shaman were kind of my baby really visually, and that was, I did lots of other, lots of ladies singing, "Oh yeah, baby." I did lots of that old stuff, and but the Shaman were really the band that I loved doing the most.
And what's the pagan new belief systems?
But there's all sorts of strains of neo-paganism. I mean, all the way from your kind of crystal shop Wiccan, all the way through to the kind of new Norse strands of today. It was very much a time in the 90s of people finding their own path back to godhead, feeling that Christianity had let everybody down, certainly Anglicanism.
Because Scandinavian black metal is an example of that. You know, it started with a lot of these singers of these bands were pagans themselves.
Absolutely.
And were inspired by that.
And you know, there's Warduna and people like that. There's some really wonderful. There's some really wonderful. I think I've struck gold. There's some really wonderful Scandinavian bands who are very kind of earth-based pagan and very old path. And I love that the Scandinavian system is still very much more intact than the Druidic, for example. So all the Druids were pretty much wiped out by the Romans, and so English paganism is always trying to piece itself back together. But we have a very strong. I mean, I'm of Viking blood, and so that does call to me. But it's a shame that we lost so much of the Ogham, which is the alphabet of the trees. That's how because the Druidism was an oral tradition, and you learn by learning the alphabet of the trees. A is for ash and aspirin, for example.
That's wonderful. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
One of my interests is Celtic mythology.
Okay.
And we don't actually know a lot about the Celtic belief system apart from stone circles and burial grounds. But it's sort of like the Native Americans, where their belief system is connected with nature, it's connected to the fairy realm and the tree spirits.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is a little bit different from Germanic paganism with Odin and so on.
Yeah. But I mean, all those forms of early belief systems, well, not early, it's not that early. It's still quite recent. They were very rooted in nature because people's lives were very rooted in nature. The elements controlled all of our lives for most of history. Nature
is the divine as well.
Absolutely. It's, the sacred in everything, seeing the sacred in everything, getting back to that. I mean, in Celtic Christianity is still very rooted in the agrarian world, of course, because people lived on farms and people were right hard up against the seasons. And so much of the celebration is to do with the turning of the seasons and celebrating a celebration for each time, which
is what these stone circles were for.
Absolutely. Well, were the Neolithic circles re-inhabited by those later peoples? Are they from earlier?
They were definitely re-habited. So in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regii Britanniae, he says after Ambrosius won his victories against the Anglo-Saxons, he got Merlin to transport the giant circle from Northern Ireland to Wiltshire. And that's why, despite Cheshire being despite there being tons of Bronze Age settlements in Cheshire, there's no stone circles. So some historians say they were also monuments for maybe battles and important events, as well as being these religious sites.
Well, the sacred landscape stretches across Britain. There is it was recognised all the way up into the modern day. I think in the Second World War they were still lighting the beacons on top of the beacon hills as warnings, and so it also becomes a part of defence. So those beacons were always sacred peaks where you could communicate along the countries, and light the fires from one end of the nation to the other.
And who knows, maybe when things hit the fan, we'll all go to castles on top of hills and defend ourselves.
Yeah,
maybe that will turn back.
Yeah, the lay of the land dictates the people of that land, so and the belief systems of that land. So
another thing I just wanted to touch on when it comes to Celtic mythology, when it comes to Celtic paganism, is mushrooms, because mushrooms are this divine experience that connects people back to nature, reminds them of their purpose of being stewards of the earth, and connects them to this Holy Spirit. And maybe that's why there's so many pagan religions such as Celtic paganism, Germanic paganism, and Native American belief systems that are so centered around nature and so centered around observing omens. And Tolkien himself, I reckon, based this character of Tom Bombadil off these fairy beings. He wrote in a letter to his friend saying, I enjoy mushrooms, particularly from a field, referring to magic mushrooms. And people who would go on walks with him would say he would stop and observe every single flower and every single leaf because he was fascinated by it. Because you can tell he had this very holy, divine experience.
Absolutely,
which we
absolutely.
connected
Well,
him.
yeah, mushrooms famously key us straight into the nature spirits. I've never understood people doing magic mushrooms in clubs.
No.
I'm very
no.
peculiar.
Yeah.
Or, lying on the floor or doing just, doing kind of general pastimes, taking part in secular activities.
Exactly.
Because it's a very sacred
It is.
experience.
And one thing I found, if you don't take if you don't take mushrooms with the idea of it being a holy sacrament, is God and the Holy Spirit doesn't show himself to you. And so people who take them at clubs and so on, you can tell that
I do
about
once every 5 or 6 years I would partake, but it's always very ritualised.
Yeah. So it's a rite of passage as well.
Absolutely, huge rite of passage, absolutely.
You can tell why the Berserkers took them as well.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Vikings, because mushrooms, they make you aware of your surroundings, your hearing's better.
Hyper aware, everything
hyper-aware.
Everything's turned up to 11.
They make you into this like sort of super being. So you would become a great warrior if you were to take.
And also, most of the old traditions are ancestor traditions, and so those transcendental experiences not only connect you with the land, but they connect you with the timeline. And so you find that, I think time travel's a bit specific, but you feel that what one feels the weight of time, and one can sense the spirit of the ancestors being very present.
Yeah.
And again, that comes from the land as well.
And they also say in the early Celtic Christian church, they also partook in mushrooms as well. So it's something that our ancestors have partaken in. And you can see where the Green Man comes from as well. In
the Green
Celtic.
Man?
Yeah.
Oh, well, now is the time of the Green Man. It is February, so the Green Man is afoot from Imbolc, which is February the 2nd. That's where the first pulse of the Green Man goes through the earth on February, which the Christians call Candlemas. And it's from February the 2nd, that's where you get the first pulse of the awakening of nature after winter. So that's a very special time.
But this is what I find so beautiful about the different pagan religions in Europe, is they were worshipping the same the same God that the Christians worship, without that fuller truth of Christ. They were already on the path of good. It's like how we have different languages, It's
Absolutely.
like Ula and Bonjour. It was their way of interpreting it through the means they had, such as mushrooms and such as nature.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity comes in as almost like a globalizing force that standardizes the map of the metaphysical world.
But the way I think of it as well, this very interesting passage in the Bible of Abraham, where God, which I believe actually to be the devil in this story, tells him, go and sacrifice your son. So him thinking it's the Lord, just as the Aztecs thought it was the Lord when they sacrificed all those humans, he goes, okay, Lord, I'm dedicated to you, I will sacrifice my son. And in the very last minute, God says, no, that's not what I want. The actual God intervenes. And this is why Christ coming down was so important, because it was him revealing what the message of the Lord actually is. So my interpretation of the past when it comes to the Celts in Britain is they weren't forced by the Romans to convert. It's more they were like the prisoners who came out of Plato's cave and saw this as more of a fulfillment of what they actually believed in. One example is Saint Albert, for example, who was actually killed by the Romans for becoming a Christian, which a lot of people forget about.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that. I think there was quite a lot of force in the conversions. I don't think it was all done peacefully. Christianity wasn't evangelizing belief. They went out to save souls and did so. So I think that it wasn't all, oh, this is marvellous, we'll just all adapt to this. And it's also to do with the power structure. So Christianity has always been associated with governance and power structures, because obviously it became the belief system of the Roman Empire. And that was very much about maintaining an empire. And so there's always been an element with all religions. However, one sees the truth behind that religion. There's the infrastructure is political.
Yeah, but that's why the Celtic Christianity was so beautiful, because you had Christianity, but you also had our ancestral pagan traditions, and they sort of molded into each other.
I do enjoy Celtic Christianity. It's very it's much more mystical and poetic.
But one thing I find interesting is when King Vortigern invited Hengist and Horsa, the Britons came to King Vortigern and they said to him, these Anglo-Saxons don't integrate, they're pagans, we're Christian, these are pagans, you need to get them out of the country. And so many pagans today are like, we need to return to our the ancestral religion of the British Isles, which is Germanic paganism. It's like, no, Britain was Christian before the Germanic pagans came here.
Yes. Yeah. But it was and Celtic before that.
Yeah.
And Druidic before that. Yeah. And which of course is so shattered.
Yeah.
It's hard to piece together. Which is why so many of the pagan paths are overlaid with other esoteric traditions. The Theosophists really introduced a lot of mix and match from the Kabbalah and Egyptian magic. So one always ends up kind of finding one's way back to the Egyptian temple at some point. Whichever esoteric path you follow, all roads seem to lead back to the bloody pyramid.
I'll have to look more into that, because I haven't gotten that far to actually researching about the Egyptians. At the moment it's Celtic Christianity. But to finish with, like, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, you were kicked out of the music industry, is that right?
No, I wasn't kicked out of the music industry, I was frozen out. So back in the day, we didn't have social media in the same way, so cancellation wasn't a dramatic event. It was a very slow death of people removing you from polite society for beliefs such as, forms of nationalism or forms of criticism of globalist policy. And so if one voiced one's opinions in public, which I did constantly, I was never shy to tell people what I actually felt about a topic. But the result of that was this slow ostracisation that happened. It was word of mouth, word spread that you weren't fit for polite society. And so as the industry became more, as all the creative industries became more uniform in their beliefs, their political belief systems, so people were ostracised who disagreed with
So you became an outcast of the outcasts.
I was always an outcast of the outcasts.
Yeah.
It's the only way. It's the only place to be, really. Obviously, as a young, kind of freaky kid, punky, freaky, dress-up kid going to the nightclubs, I was outcast of mainstream society in the 80s, and then I never fitted in with even the kind of alternative underground world in London, because I had these deeply held beliefs about place and the sacredness of place and great pride in my people and the country and my history, or the history of the people of this island. That was always seen as a bit outré and a bit unacceptable. That was always seen as backward and not progressive enough. But I mean, also, there was a time in the 90s, I hate to do this Gen X 90s thing, but there was a wonderful time when it felt like all of these arguments had been put to bed. There was kind of small immigrant populations, and we all got on really well. And there was, the early acid house scene was incredibly diverse. I hate to use that term, but the kind of gay issue had been put to bed, and everyone was just partying with each other, and all the young people were just kind of getting on fine because none of those identities had been weaponized against a kind of a fabled majority. And so there was this wonderful honeymoon period up until about 97, 98, after Tony Blair is when, of course, all of the fracturing begins to happen. But this period between kind of 91 and 97 was pretty. Everything kind of was pretty well balanced. As far as people getting along with one another, and it felt about right where we were in the country.
Yeah. So it was really political polarization which started splitting people.
Yeah, I mean, as far as political polarization is concerned, during the 80s and 90s, everyone was anti-Tory. Of course, that just kind of came.
Unites the
yeah,
people.
that just came with the territory. Is that you were automatically anti-Mrs. Thatcher. But that was because they did some really oppressive things to their youth. They had some really oppressive policies. There was a very famous Battle of Beanfield. So every year, all the kind of crusty hippies, what was left over of the psychedelic hippie movement, had kind of merged with this new dance phenomena that was happening. And there used to be the Stonehenge Festival every summer at solstice. And Hawkwind would play famously as the sun rose on the summer solstice.
Oh, wow.
And one year in the late, I can't remember, was it 89? I think it was 90. There was what they call the Battle of Beanfield, where the police, basically Mrs. Thatcher sent the police in to break up the travellers' convoy and this festival. And it was very brutal, and people got really. But you can find videos of it online.
What was their reasoning for it?
It was real stormtroopers going in and smashing family vehicles. You know, families were living in vehicles, and it was horrific. It was very violent and very horrific. So there was that state oppression on any kind of outsider. It was quite extreme. Of course, there was the poll tax riots. It was by no means a quiet time politically. Mrs. Thatcher really caused a lot of social hardship and unrest. You can argue that there was a great deal of necessity in breaking up the unions, who had become too controlling, too powerful, were just making everyone's life a misery. And so she had to kind of break the unions, but everything just seemed to escalate and go a bit too far. So it was very normal for young people to be kind of anti this form of conservatism. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher's economic policies lay the foundation for corporate globalism.
Collapse, yeah. One of my granddad's from Liverpool, and one of the stories he told me about when he worked in the factories in Liverpool in the early 80s is when Thatcher first got in, all his colleagues were celebrating. Her second term, they were all out of jobs, every single one of them.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, and all these northern towns don't vote Thatcher.
Yeah.
Because what she did to the north, completely.
Yeah, that was a harrowing. It was the embrace of globalization and shipping everybody's jobs overseas. It laid the foundation for the whole waste of the West that we've seen since.
And thanks to her, there's towns in the north that I've witnessed, because I live close to Liverpool, I live in Cheshire, which are just complete ghost towns.
Yeah.
And there's nothing there, and people get hooked on drugs, they get into fights because there's nothing to do.
Yeah.
It's like the ice cream wars in Glasgow, for example. Yeah. My final question for you is, what would be your message for any new inspiring musicians?
Well, the industry has collapsed. So unless you go through music is effectively free. People view music. This is why it's lost its cultural relevance, because there's no value in it. When we were young, we had to save money and buy pieces of plastic that were records. And there was a great deal of investment in the bands you liked. It was a very tribal pastime, being into music. And since file sharing online really came to prominence in the late 90s, the entire financial structure of the industry collapsed. So getting into music as a career is a risky business. So there's still money, you can still make money, but it's more in sound design, music for films, music for TV. That's what they call sync, where your music is synced to other people's images. But artists like Tom MacDonald have really shown that if you're willing to put the graft in, and that is a hell of a graft, and do everything yourself, run your own cottage industry, there is a living to be made out of it, and you can still make a living from touring and playing live. But it's not the get-rich-quick scheme that a talented musician could have partaken in the 1970s and 1980s. So the entire approach to being a composer or a performer in a band has shifted dramatically, but it can be done. You can play the algorithms, like the TikTok algorithm. So, there's also this whole industry of making 27 to 30 second clips of music for people to dance around to on TikTok. So I think that there's interesting things happening at both ends. You have this really short clip culture of social media, but then there's also this long form, whether it's Sleep Tube in these kind of 8 hours of relaxing crystal shop music, ambient sleep cores, 8-hour streams. People make quite good money from that as well. And serious classical composition, it's difficult because of having to pay musicians. You have the musicians' union. So if you're writing for anything larger than a quartet, it becomes very expensive to stage. But getting together in a band and kicking it around and realizing that you've got something interesting, something good, marketing it yourself online, distributing it yourself online has never been easier, but it's never been harder to be heard because it's such a cacophony. So self-marketing is really the name of the game. And if you can be bothered spending your life wired into promoting your social media platforms, you can still do it, you can still get there. But it's not like you get signed by a major record company and you get your £1 million record deal. That doesn't exist anymore, which is a real shame. I mean, you can go, the Sony and Universal still exist, and everybody's pretty much a subsidiary of them in the professional industry. But of course, it's ideologically captured, as we all know. So if you want to speak your mind, you want to speak openly through your music, that's always going to be limited going through the front door. But it's still, if you're willing to bend the knee, one can still make a few bob. But ultimately, I think all true artists, are driven to create, regardless of income streams. So if you are an artist who is absolutely called to speak through your music or through any medium, then you will find a way. You will find a way to survive. So do it. I say absolutely do it. I think that what is now the alternative culture, which is anyone who stands against the forces of globo homo, shall we say, I think it's going to become very vibrant over the next 5 years. In fact, I would say that if you're interested in doing something exciting, the next 5 to 10 years is going to be very fertile ground. I think there's generations of people growing up now, of younger people growing up now, with a lot of energy. Music has always been one of the most powerful, motivating forces. So I think that I can feel the energy is there that could potentially be harnessed through bands that can express that zeitgeist, that energy, that emerging. It's kind of both a cry of anguish, yet a joyous celebration. There is hope. It might be slim at the moment, in Europe especially, but I'm getting quite good hope vibes from the younger generations like yourself, and I just think there's huge opportunity. I think there's to carve out our own scene, to carve out new scenes, new sounds, new styles. Britain has always been the crucible for youth movements, and I think we've got one more left in us. I do. I think so. I think it's a really good time to get creating, get thinking, get producing, get mixing, get playing, do your thing, get partying, get a warehouse together. You know, just don't worry about licenses. Don't worry about getting caught. Just do your thing. Whether it's in a house or a warehouse or a mate's pub, wherever it is, in a community centre, get people together in real life. That's how the energy builds. You can take it online. It has the online life and the in real life thing. They have such different energies, but I really do feel that there is a physical buzz in the air. There's a perceivable buzz coming from your generation and younger that I think is really exciting. So I think there's loads of opportunities to express yourself and have a great time. And what's more, change the world, because those expressions do change the world.
Thank you very much.